Well, it's week 6, and how much has changed in a little over a month? I'm getting questions this week like, should I start Chris Olave or Darius Slayton? How did we get here? Well, let's talk about it and find out whether you should indeed be starting Chris Olave or Darius Slayton and all the other start sits you'll need for week 6 of fantasy football on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley, and gosh, I'm getting some questions on names I did not expect to be hearing at the start of the season. Jalen Tolbert is one that's been popping off all week. Is he someone that's going to be in your starting lineups? What about Rashid Shaheed, Michael Wilson, all these guys that we never would have considered at the start of the season? That is the fun of fantasy football. But there's heaps of other positions to cover as well, as we'll go through every position and talk about the starts and sits for week 6. If you haven't already, be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. My Instagram is at the Fantasy First Down, so you can always DM me any questions there at any time. I'm happy to answer them as long as the games haven't started yet. On Twitter, I am at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website with all of our rankings on there is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles at football.rasball.com. But let's get into today's rankings. And we're starting things off with the quarterbacks. I'm basically going to take you through all of these, talk about who you should be starting, who you should be sitting, and why. Anyone in green has a top 9-ish matchup, I believe it is, and anyone in red has a bottom 9 matchup. That's according to points conceded to that position, according to Fantasy Pros, who I do a lot of my work for, of course. So let's start things off with the quarterbacks. And look, Lamar Jackson, indeed, against Jaden Daniels. What a matchup this is going to be to start the week. Probably the highest scoring game of the week. Certainly will be, according to Vegas. Both of those guys are must starts. They're going to do a lot with their legs. Plus, they're probably going to have to pass to keep their teams in the game. So this is going to be a very interesting matchup. Jalen Hurts, always consistent coming off his bye week. Does get Cleveland, but you still got to start him. Joe Burrow's been good. He gets a solid matchup. Jordan Love and Dak Prescott jumping back up there with their good matchups. Josh Allen a lot lower than you would usually see him. Now, even though he's below guys like Jordan Love and Dak Prescott, don't drop Josh Allen for those guys, or indeed go and pick those guys up and sit Allen on your bench. He's pretty close to those other guys there. And realistically, you don't want 2 quarterbacks if you don't need it, because you're wasting a bench spot. So just start Josh Allen and deal with the fact that it's a tough matchup against the Jets. He could still produce. He's Josh Allen, so it's okay to feel fine about that. Caleb Williams pops up into my top 10. He, of course, takes on Jacksonville. That is the number 1 matchup for quarterbacks. He was pretty solid last week. He is improving. Still a rookie, but he's going to get better. His pass catches are getting healthier with Keenan Allen back, of course, as well. And Cole Kmet now playing every snap, or most snaps as well. So he should be very solid this week. Now, it's the next set of guys that's going to get very interesting. Justin Fields is a name that a lot of people have been talking about because there is a legitimate chance that he gets benched at some stage during this game. Now, to be fair, they are favorites and they should be winning. So if something would have to go badly wrong for this to occur, they'd have to be behind and he'd have to be really struggling. I do think he probably gets through this game and produces fine. But the Raiders aren't exactly the best matchup. So dropped him down a little bit because of all that risk. The high upside guys, Daniel Jones and Kirk Cousins, ahead of the current, I believe, quarterback 3 on the season, Baker Mayfield. It's a little bit wild, but Mayfield takes on the Saints. The Saints don't have Derek Carr. They're going to struggle to score points and move the ball. I don't think Tampa's going to need to really throw that much. And for that reason, it's really hard to feel good about Baker having a really strong, solid game. Jones, on the other hand, takes on the Bengals, and he's been good the last couple of weeks, and now he takes on a team that concedes a lot of points and could be in a shootout. Meanwhile, Kirk Cousins takes on the team that we saw get destroyed by Caleb Williams last week, so I do think that he could score well. The only risk there, of course, with Kirk Cousins, you can run on Carolina, and potentially they just run it out with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. We'll have to see how that goes, but Cousins certainly has a heap of upside. A couple of guys dropping down, guys like Trevor Lawrence, Anthony Richardson, I'm not starting first week back. CJ Stroud, he's just been so inconsistent at the moment. I do want to have him a little bit higher, but I can't put him ahead of Mayfield. and Jones and Cousins have those great matchups. So I got him a little bit lower. I do think New England could also really struggle with Drake May making his debut. So I think they could be a little bit ugly as well. Spencer Rattler is actually higher than quite a few other people because I do think he could potentially be pretty aggressive. And so for that reason, I've got him ranked a little bit higher. Same deal with Will Levis as well. But realistically, probably not starting any of those guys outside Superflex leagues where you're in a fair bit of trouble. Let's talk running backs. And I mean, Derrick Henry, he has been very good at times. And he takes on Washington in what could be a very high-scoring game. It is very possible they run it a lot. You can run the ball on Washington, even though it's easier to pass it. I do think he's going to have a lot of scoring opportunities. Same thing with Saquon. Saquon gets so many goal line carries, despite the fact they've got Jalen Hurts, that I do think it's very hard to rank him any lower than the first few. Whether that continues happening over the season, we'll see. But he's had 2 games with multiple touchdowns, and that gives him massive upside. Jordan Mason, of course, in there, got that unfortunate injury. I think he was trending towards a very good game. But so Alvin Kamara comes in after him. He's battling some injuries, so it's hard to know whether that's going to affect his snaps or not. I am tempted to rank him a little bit lower, but realistically, you're starting all these guys. And even though Bijan Robinson's been disappointing in the best matchup in football, even though he's been battling a couple of knocks and had a limited practice earlier in the week, you absolutely still have to start Bijan. Against Carolina, it's so easy to run on them. He should be involved. He should produce. Same thing with Breece Hall. It's been very disappointing, but everyone's been running on Buffalo. You'd have to feel like that's what the Jets do, even with their new coaching staff. They've got to get Breece Hall more involved. That's got to be one of the things that they say to the new head coach. Hey, Breece Hall's your best player. Let's get him a little bit more involved. I know Braylon Allen's fantastic. I talked about him a lot in the preseason, but you've got to use Breece Hall. I think we'll see a lot more Hall now that we've had a change in coaching staff, even though it's not a new OC. Josh Jacobs, another good matchup against Arizona. And Jahmyr Gibbs has been a little bit disappointing because of the split, but against Dallas, he's starting to slowly take over. I think this is a good matchup. He's someone that you'd want to be starting. Tony Pollard as well gets a fantastic matchup against Indy. He has kind of been starting to take over a little bit from Spears. Spears got a lot of touches last week, but that's just because they had a lot of touches in total. In general, I still think Pollard is the main guy, and I feel like he's got a heap of upside in this matchup. He's not going to do most weeks, but this week, because they're going to be able to run the ball a lot and probably score a lot of points, I feel like he's got that touchdown upside and that touch upside as well. Just below him, James Conner, so consistent. David Montgomery, I talked about that matchup already. Chuba Hubbard, in a bad matchup against Atlanta, he's just their number one weapon. He is their main guy realistically, and they just seem to use him for that reason. So that's why he's so high. DeAndre Swift gets a fantastic matchup against Jacksonville. It is more of a passing matchup, but I do still think that he's got a good chance to find the end zone. Even though Roshan Johnson's been taking a lot of the goal line carries, I think we could still see Swift have a very good game. Couple of guys in really interesting situations. In fact, there's a lot of running backs in awkward injury situations. So I'll talk through a lot of these. This may change by the time you watch this, obviously. I'm only talking about stuff that's current when I'm recording it. But if you're watching it later on, some of this stuff might have changed. So make sure you look up the latest news on each of these running backs and really all injured players. Joe Mixon, I do expect he'll probably play. I think they've also got Dameon Pierce back. Plus, potentially, they could also have Cam Akers involved. So that's going to get a little bit awkward, but I do think Mixon is going to be the main guy. And if it turns out that he is fully healthy and he's going to get the full load, probably even move him up as high as 13, I think. J.K. Dobbins with Gus Edwards out. It's not the greatest matchup against Denver. It's not the matchup it was a couple last season, but it is still a solid matchup. I do think he's going to be busy, but I think we probably see some either Hassan Haskins or Kamani Vidal or both. Potentially, but Dobbins will be the main guy. It's just hard to really trust his upside given the way they use their running backs in general. They get a lot of touches, but they really just try to slow the whole thing down and they don't score a lot of points in general. The Chargers, I think it could be a very low-scoring game. Najee Harris gets a great matchup, but Jalen Warren being back really hurts him. But he's still above most other guys. I do think Warren will be quite limited, and it is a good matchup against the Raiders where they should be winning. Bucky Irving is higher because Rashad White is doubtful and probably out by the time you're listening to this. He's taking on the Saints, which isn't the greatest matchup, but he should be their number one guy. So I do like his upside as well. I think he should be very solid. Rico Dowdle started to take over from Ezekiel Elliott, but he gets a terrible matchup against Detroit. Really hard to trust him, but at least he's going to get the load, and therefore, for that reason, I can rank him ahead of a lot of these committee guys. Javonte Williams, similarly, turning into their main guy. They're still using a bit of Jaleel McLaughlin, and Audric Estime is likely to be back this week, but I do still think Williams is the main guy. It's just a tough matchup against the Chargers. Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby are in a real committee split at the moment. Etienne's a little bit higher for me because I do think that they'll probably do a little bit of passing to their running backs too, and he does get a lot of those touches. But Tank Bigsby's been doing most of the red zone work, and you can definitely run the ball against the Bears. So I think they both have plenty of upside. I'm tempted to move Bigsby higher. In PPR, it's still Etienne for me, but I do think that Bigsby could end up higher than Trav before the end of the week for me, potentially. Brian Robinson Jr., of course, battling injuries. I think even if he's active, he's really risky. Taking on Baltimore, which is a really good run defense, still battling injuries. We saw he started last week, scored a couple of touchdowns, but wasn't very efficient on the ground, and ultimately got taken out, didn't play at all in the second half. I think they like what they have in Jeremy McNichols and Austin Eckler. So realistically, it's not going to hurt them a lot to take Robinson out, especially if he's not playing particularly well. James Cook, of course, also battling an injury. Typically wouldn't be the worst matchup against the Jets, but it's kind of hard to score on the Jets at the moment. Their defense is solid, even though their offense sucks. They've also had some easiest matchups defensively. So Cook, I don't know, it's really hard to trust him this week. I think if it turns out he's absolutely, totally healthy, then he will rise up to around 18 or so. But it is a tough matchup and a tough situation. Antonio Gibson starting, not this time because Ramondre Stevenson's being punished, but because he's being punished by having an injury. So Antonio Gibson is the starter. Can you trust him? I do think we'll see a little bit of Jermichael Hasty, enough to make it a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not the greatest matchup against Houston. Jerome Ford has been in and out of the clear starter role. They use a lot of Donta Foreman some weeks and not other weeks. Hard to know whether to trust him, but he's above most of those true committee guys like Zach Moss, who seems to be healthy again. He's splitting with Chase Brown. I do think we're going to see plenty of checkdowns in that game, which helps Moss, but they both have opportunities. Devin Singletary seems to be back on the other side of that game. That moves Tyron Tracy back down, but it's hard to really trust him in this matchup and in this situation first week back. Trey Sermon probably starting with Jonathan Taylor out, but terrible matchup against Tennessee. It's very hard to move the ball on them in general. So for that reason, I'm not trusting him in this situation. In fact, Tennessee have conceded, even though they've conceded the 20th most points to running backs, and they've conceded the least points to wide receivers. So you do have to move the ball on them somehow. I don't know that it's going to be Sermon. I think we're going to see enough Goodson to make it inconvenient. This is not a matchup where I'm targeting him, even though I do quite like him. There's just so many committee backs in there. It's hard to trust Sermon relative to the others. Some lower down players who actually have good matchups, guys like Tyjae Spears, got a lot of touches last week because Pollard was just getting too many touches and they needed to use more Spears. He's also healthier now, so we could see more of him here. He's someone that I can see rising up my rankings potentially because there is the possibility that they ultimately are winning this game relatively easily. I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen, but they are certainly favorites. And they could easily end up ahead. I think they're 2.5-point favorites at the moment, but that could certainly change. Algier also a guy that they could use a lot because it's Carolina, and you want to use them a lot for that reason. Austin Eckler will move up a lot if Brian Robinson is injured. Roschon Johnson drops back down because they don't now have that fantastic matchup, but I still think he could be involved. Same situation as Braylon Allen. I think the Alexander Madison one's interesting because he was starting for the first 3 quarters, really struggled, and then they used Amir Abdullah in the 4th quarter, and he was a bit more effective. So it is possible that Abdullah takes over. I think it's probably still Madison starting, and they give him another crack, but that's why Madison's low and Abdullah is high relative to where you'd expect. Nothing else particularly interesting there. I think Jermichael Hasty is like a desperation guy that's probably available because Stevenson is out. And Ty Johnson and Ray Davis will both be interesting if James Cook is out. I will favor Davis to get most of the touches, and Johnson will get the passing down work. I don't know that either of them are going to have a lot of value against the Jets. Sad to see Tyron Tracy back down this low after he was so good when he was available. It is possible that he outperforms that because Singletary might lose touches. Not sure. We'll see how that goes. Wide receivers, and I mean, CeeDee Lamb is a great matchup. I think he could be very good this week. Great for DFS lineups if you're going to pay up for somebody or pay up for Lamb. Jamar Chase, not the same great matchup, but he was great last week. I think he could still have another good week. And Amon-Ra St. Brown against Dallas. It's not easy to pass on Dallas necessarily. They're not the toughest defense, but I think they're the 9th fewest points conceded to wide receivers. But if you're going to target Dallas, I mean, you might as well have Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's got the talent to get through it. And realistically, we are short a lot of the top wide receivers that we'd usually have in this area here. Usually you'd be seeing guys like Justin Jefferson, obviously not available this week, which is why St. Brown makes it into the top three, despite the tough matchup. A couple of names that you would not expect to see here. Drake London has been good for quite a while, and I think he's got massive touchdown upside. They use him a lot in the red zone, and for that reason, I'm willing to rank him higher than usual. I just think the chance of him getting a touchdown is extremely high. DJ Moore gets that fantastic matchup against Jacksonville. Number one against Jacksonville doesn't always have success. I was talking to Bobby from Rasball on the Rasball podcast, just to check out their YouTube channel as well. He was talking about how often some defenses allow the second guy a lot more points, and that can be Jacksonville, but they have still had games where the number one has also been very good too. So this should be still a solid DJ Moore game. Really like his upside. Jaden Reed has been so good at times, but Christian Watson potentially being back could have an impact on that. We shall see. I still think he's a very good option. AJ Brown, first week back. It's hard to fully trust him in that tough matchup against Cleveland, but still a top 10 option for store. Stephon Diggs, way higher in a fantastic matchup against New England. They are very weak against slot receivers. And we've already seen DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel. Metcalf could have been fantastic if he hadn't had that long touchdown brought back for a holding penalty, and Deebo was fantastic. We tend to overreact to things as fantasy football managers, or at least a lot of people do based on what I get in my messages. A lot of people saying, well, why do you have Deebo ranked ahead of Brandon Ayuk? Because Ayuk had one good week. You can't expect him to suddenly be amazing for the rest of the season. He's always got high upside. It was always going to be an interesting matchup against Seattle because they are weak against out wide receivers. But you're rarely going to get all of those San Fran guys being good in a given week. You're usually going to have two of them, probably. In this week, it was Kittle and Samuel. Some weeks it will be Ayuk. Some weeks it will be the running back. Some weeks you'll even get three of them going, but you'll very rarely get all four. So you just got to understand you're going to get that randomness happening with all your San Fran players, and you just got to accept that when you draft them. Same deal can happen with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. There are games where they're both good. I still like Mike Evans better. I think he's got more upside. Godwin is higher in consensus. I don't fully understand that, and quite a lot higher. He hasn't had those big weeks, and it's not like you can really attack New Orleans through the slot particularly. In fact, you can attack them more effectively out wide, which is where Mike Evans spends all his time. So I have Evans higher. Godwin's still a solid option. They're both good. T. Higgins, he looked good last week. He's looked good the last 2 weeks, in fact. So I feel good about T. Higgins as a good, solid starter for you. So a couple of guys with great matchups. Zay Flowers gets Washington. We've seen how good they've been for a long time. Not as good a matchup as they've been in the past, but Flowers is still a guy that will get a lot of targets, I expect, in this game. If not, you've got to imagine at least Rashad Bateman does or something. Someone's got to out wide because that's where you can target them. Marvin Harrison Jr. gets Green Bay. They've conceded a lot of points to our wide receivers, as have Baltimore, who are, of course, taking on Washington. So Terry McLaurin will get a lot of targets out wide as well. Whether he can do something with them, that's going to depend on Jaden Daniels and how clean they can keep the pocket for him, or at least give him opportunities to make plays. Then a lot of guys that we've seen higher in the past, Deontay Johnson, Devonta Smith, and Garrett Wilson have all been top 10 earlier this season. Don't love their matchups. Don't love the situations this week. The other guys have more upside. Danamu was fantastic last week, but he's not really a touchdown threat. He kind of needs a lot of passes and a lot of big plays. And I don't think they'll need to do that against Carolina. So he's still relatively high, but if you wanted to start guys like Thomas and Williams, I wouldn't call you crazy. They've just got tougher matchups. And that's why I don't have Thomas higher and why I don't have Williams higher. Chris Olave gets a good matchup, but with Spencer Rattler, it's hard to trust that. I don't really feel particularly good about that. Tank Dell, it's not the greatest matchup, but he does have Nico Collins out. Does he take over that role, or do we see Xavier Hutchinson playing that X receiver and being in there on 12 personnel? I think they probably split the 12 personnel, which would mean it's a solid situation for Dell, but he lacks the upside that Collins did. I do think that Diggs is probably going to be the main guy for Houston this week. Amari Cooper, another good matchup, but he hasn't made the most of all of his good matchups. Very hit and miss at the moment. It's very disappointing. I'm a big Amari Cooper fan. He will have boom weeks occasionally. You just kind of have to keep putting him in and hoping they arrive. George Pickens played less than 60% snaps for the first time in his career last week, and it was apparently load management, which is rubbish. I don't know what's going on, but something's going on there, and I don't trust it. So if you are wary of that sort of thing, then I would consider sitting Pickens, especially for someone like a Wandale Robinson or Josh Downs in PPR. This is half PPR, of course. Robinson and Downs both expected to get a lot of targets. If Pittman's in, which is wild because they were talking about putting him on IR, then maybe he's going to play this week. But if Pittman plays, and at the time of recording, we don't know about that, then Pittman probably slides in around this region and Downs drops a little bit. I don't like the Anthony Richardson situation, but it might still work out for Downs because he plays so close to him. They can get some good safe passes to him. Wandale's just been getting a massive amount of targets with Malik Neighbours out. I know a lot of people are talking about Darius Slayton, but it's Wandale Robinson I prefer. Slayton does appear here, though. There he is, 38. I know a lot of people expected him to be higher. I think it's a little bit fluky. Whether it happens this week, I mean, it might. But it's kind of like, I don't know, like Gabe Davis a couple of years ago, where he has these big games and then does nothing. There's a real risk of Darius Slayton doing nothing. Shaheed's another one that's really risky because Spencer Rattler is back, but we've seen he's heavily involved and it's a good matchup, so I can't have him much lower. Jacoby Myers, the number one guy in Vegas, but I don't know, Trey Tucker's still hanging around, but Myers is the guy you want for fantasy. Kirk gets that tough matchup against Chicago. Jalen Tolbert is a name that I wanted to talk about. I kind of signaled this a while back. Brandon Cooks had kind of been losing the number 2 slot anyway. Tolbert outgained him, out-touched him, out-everythinged him in the first few weeks. I do think that Tolbert was kind of turning into the number 2 receiver. And now Cooks is on IR and Tolbert can fully take it over. And there is some value in that. They don't have a lot of other weapons. They're not using the run game like they used to. It's CeeDee Lamb, it's Jake Ferguson, and it's this guy, Jalen Tolbert. So I do think that potentially he could be even higher than this in the future if he can keep producing as he has been. Robert Dunze gets a fantastic matchup too against Jacksonville. I think he could potentially end up way higher than this, or he could do absolutely nothing. That is the fun of having one of these kind of like number 2 receivers in these fluky situations. Hard for me to have Calvin Ridley lower than this against the Colts, but hard to have him higher when he's Calvin Ridley playing this offense with Will Levis. So this is where he ended up. Michael Wilson, similar situation. At least he's got Kyler Murray, but it's a good matchup, but I don't really trust his situation. Lad McConkey, tough matchup, so he goes lower. Same with Cortland Sutton. Alan Lazard still in the same area despite the tough matchup. Keenan Allen dropped a little bit because Jacksonville's more of an out wide situation that you try to target. So that's why Allen, the main slot guy, is a little bit lower. DeAndre Hopkins running so few routes at the moment. He's running like less than 20 routes a week. And he's getting targets on like a third of his routes. But it's very hard to trust that. And you're really limiting your upside because you're not out there enough to really get true upside out of your players. Romeo Dobbs in. I don't know what's happening with Christian Watson. I've got him playing in these rankings, which is why Dontavian Wicks doesn't appear. Wicks hasn't been particularly good, especially last week. And he was playing behind Watson. So I think Watson's probably still the starter, but there's a bit of a split. And especially with Watson coming back for the first week, it could be that the split favors Wicks this week and then slowly trends towards Watson. Either way, I'm avoiding both of them. Jerry Jeudy was really disappointing last week, but he's got a fantastic slot matchup against Philly. So he's someone that you can risk starting. Same thing with Rashad Bateman. Fantastic out-wide matchup, but very, very, very risky. Ray McLeod just has scoring upside, but against Carolina, can't really trust the slot guy. Couldn't find other people to put above him. It's not that I like Ray McLeod. I just don't like a lot of wide receivers this week. Finally, tight ends. And gosh, George Kittle had a good game. If only you'd started him. Hopefully you did. Look, I had him number 1. I don't think that's really a surprise. I think most people did. Jake Ferguson also has a good matchup against Detroit, as does Trey McBride against Green Bay. Ferguson and McBride really tossed up having them either way around, but most of you aren't going to have both of them. If you do, I'd Ferguson a bit higher because he has a little bit more touchdown upside and I think slightly more target upside. Brock Bowers has had some good games, but he was a bit disappointing of late, so we'll see how that goes against Pittsburgh. Tucker Kraft is higher because Luke Musgrave has gone on IR, which means that Kraft should get more routes and more targets. So I do hope that he has another solid game. Sam Laporta, last year's number 1, nowhere near number 1 this year. We'll see if that starts to turn around as the season goes on. Kyle Pitts, good matchup against Carolina. Should have some real touchdown upside, but also possible he does nothing because they don't need him to. And then some tough matchups for Kincaid, Goddard, and Ingram, who's presumably back from injury. Hard to trust tight ends like pluses and minuses there, whether it's a good matchup or not, because they are so variable with tight ends. So take the colors with tight ends with a slight grain of salt. Tyler Conklin's had a couple of good weeks. I don't really like anyone in this range, which is why Conklin's up there. It's just that he's running so many routes and he's starting to get some targets, but it's entirely possible that changes when they change the coaching staff. Pat Fryermuth, kind of similar situation, been very efficient on less routes, but still been very involved. Dalton Schultz running more routes with Brevin Jordan injured, but not getting the targets. Maybe Nico Collins being out will mean more targets for Schultz. We didn't really see it last week, but we might see it this week. Cole Kmet running a lot more routes as well, but Keenan Allen being back really hurts him. David Njoku, I don't expect him to run every route. I don't think he's fully healthy. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't play at all against Philly, which is why he's quite low. The Baltimore guys, it's an interesting situation where Likely was hardly involved, got 3 targets, but 2 of them were touchdowns. Andrews was more involved, but wasn't really able to do much with them, like 5 targets for 50 yards or something like that. That's not great for Mark Andrews. And then Charlie Kohler's getting involved as well. So it's hard to trust any of those guys. I don't want to start them, even though they could still go okay. Kate Otten's been pretty consistently okay. Hunter Henry might turn things around with Drake May. We'll see. Zach Ertz in that boom game. Who knows? I don't know. I don't want to start any of those other tight ends at all. And that's all we've got for week 6 of fantasy football. I hope you've enjoyed the Start Sit Show. If you've got questions, you can just whack them down in the comments. Or if you want something a little bit more likely to get answered quickly, hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. You can also tweet me, or whatever we're calling it now, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. That's also where I release a lot of my news and information and things like that on Twitter too. You can check out our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. If you want to see updates on my rankings, I will have updates out as we get closer to the games. Plus, it would be fantastic if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. That really helps us out. And you can also check out my articles at football.razzball.com. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Good luck for week 6 of fantasy football.